Most of what holds a skyscraper up, you will never see. You might walk past a great tall building on a busy street, all gleaming glass and quiet height reaching upward into a pale blue sky. And never once think about what is happening far below your feet. Deep underground, in the cool, dark earth, the real story is already beginning. And it is a slow, quiet, rather wonderful story. The kind of story you could think about for a long time and still find something new in it. So let us go all the way down there first. Let us begin right at the beginning, at the very bottom of things, down where no one ever goes after the building is finished. When engineers decide to build a skyscraper, the first thing they do is dig. They dig a very, very big hole. Not a garden sort of hole, not even a swimming pool sort of hole. A truly enormous hole, the kind that takes months to make, with diggers and drills and enormous trucks rumbling in and out day after day. And they dig this hole before there is even a single floor of the building above the ground. Before there are walls, before there are windows, before there is anything at all that you would recognize as a building. There is just this great, wide hole going down and down into the earth. Why? Well, because the building needs somewhere to hold on. Think about a tree for a moment. A big, old tree. The kind that has stood in the same spot for 100 years, through summer after summer and winter after winter. If you look at the trunk, it is tall and steady. But underneath the ground, the roots are spreading out in all directions, gripping the soil, reaching down to where the earth is firm and damp and deep. The roots are, in some ways, the most important part of the whole tree. Without them, even the sturdiest trunk would simply tip over in the first strong wind. A skyscraper needs something very much like that. It needs roots. And so, at the bottom of that great hole, the engineers begin to build what are called foundations. Foundations are the part of a building that connect it to the earth, that say to the ground, "Here we are, please hold us." And the ground, if you have found the right kind of ground, says quietly, "Yes, all right, I will." Now, the engineers need to be quite careful about what sort of ground they are building on. Not all ground is the same, which might seem obvious when you think about it, but it is something that took people a very long time to properly understand. Some ground is soft. Clay, for instance, or sand that has been sitting by a river for thousands of years. You can press your finger into soft ground. And if you tried to put a very tall building on top of soft ground without doing anything special, the building would gradually, slowly, over many years, sink. it would press down into the soft earth the way you might press your thumb into warm dough. Isn't that a strange thing to imagine? A whole enormous building slowly sinking, like something in a dream. But engineers are clever about this. When the ground is soft, they drive long poles called piles deep into the earth. These piles are usually made of concrete or steel, and they are very long, sometimes 30 or 40 or even 50 meters long. They go down through all that soft clay or sand, all the way down to the harder rock underneath, the solid bedrock that has been there since long before any city ever existed, since long before people existed at all. And then the building sits on top of those piles, which sit on top of the bedrock, which has been sitting there quite peacefully for millions of years and is very unlikely to go anywhere now. Can you imagine it? All those long poles going down and down through the earth, right through the soft layers, all the way to the old rock below. Like the legs of a very patient creature, standing perfectly still, waiting. Some skyscrapers need hundreds of these piles. The Burj Khalifa in Dubai, which is, at the moment, the tallest building in the world, has 194 piles under it, each one nearly 50 meters long. That is a lot of patient waiting going on underground. A lot of quiet gripping. And once those piles are in place and the foundations are built up around them, thick mats of concrete, dense and heavy and steady, then the building can begin to grow upward, slowly, carefully, floor by floor, reaching toward the sky. The frame of a skyscraper is made mostly of steel. Steel is a remarkable material, worth thinking about for a moment. It is strong enough to hold up enormous weights, floor after floor after floor, and all the furniture and people and air conditioning units and water tanks that go inside those floors. And yet it is also, compared to stone or concrete, surprisingly light for its strength. You can build very tall with steel without the whole thing becoming impossibly heavy. The steel comes in big sections, long beams and columns, and cranes lift them into place, one piece at a time, building up a sort of grid, a skeleton, a frame. The workers who put this frame together are called iron workers, and for a very long time, until quite recently, really, they did this work without safety harnesses, walking along steel beams hundreds of meters above the ground as calmly as most of us would walk along a pavement. There are photographs of them from the early days of skyscraper building, sitting on beams and eating their lunch, with the whole city spread out below them like a map. Quite extraordinary. This steel frame is the bones of the building. And just like your bones hold you up and give you your shape, the steel frame holds the skyscraper up and gives it its shape. Without it, all the glass and concrete and everything else would simply be a pile of materials on the ground, with no particular reason to stay tall. But bones alone, as you might have noticed if you have ever watched a person move, are not quite enough. Bones need to be connected. They need joints and tendons and muscles to hold them together and make them work as a whole. A skyscraper needs something similar. In the very center of most skyscrapers, right in the middle, running all the way from the bottom to the very top, there is a great, thick column of concrete. Engineers call it the core. And the core is, in many ways, the spine of the building. It is not hollow. Or rather, it is a little hollow. It has lifts running through it and stairs and pipes and cables. But the walls of the core are enormously thick, sometimes a meter or more of solid reinforced concrete. And this concrete core is incredibly stiff and strong. It does not want to bend. It does not want to twist. It just wants to stand there, solid and patient, running from the ground all the way up to the roof. Everything else, all those steel beams, all those floors, is connected to the core. The core is what holds it all together. The core is what makes the building one thing rather than a collection of separate pieces. Isn't that a lovely idea somehow? That inside all that shining glass and all those busy offices and all those little windows with their little lights, right in the very middle of everything, there is this quiet, solid spine, just standing there, holding everything steady. You would never know it was there from the outside. But there it is, all the same. Now here is something that surprises a great many people when they first hear it. Skyscrapers move, not very much. Not in a way you would find alarming if you were standing inside one. But they move, they sway. On a very windy day, the top of a very tall skyscraper might move back and forth by a meter or two, sometimes even more, in the very tallest buildings. And this is not a problem. This is, in fact, exactly what is supposed to happen. Think about that tree again. In a strong wind, a rigid tree, one that refused to bend at all, would simply snap. You have probably seen this happen after a storm. The trees that fall are often the ones that were too stiff, too proud, too unwilling to give a little. But a flexible tree, one that can sway and lean and come back to upright again, survives. It bends with the wind and then returns quietly to where it was before. A skyscraper is the same. The steel frame is designed to be slightly flexible, not wobbly, not at all, but just flexible enough that when the wind pushes against all those hundreds of floors of glass and concrete, the building can lean a tiny amount, absorb the push, and then, when the wind eases, stand straight again. This is, if you think about it, a very wise way to be. To yield just a little rather than resist with everything you have. It is a principle that turns up in a surprising number of places. But engineers, being the curious and thorough sort of people that they are, they did not simply decide to make buildings flexible and leave it at that. They also invented something rather clever to make sure the swaying stays comfortable. It is called a tuned mass damper. This is, admittedly, quite a grand name for what is essentially a very large and very heavy pendulum. But it works beautifully, so perhaps it deserves its grand name. Here is how it works. At the very top of the building, sometimes near the top, sometimes almost at the very peak, engineers suspend an enormous weight. In some buildings, this weight is a steel ball. In others, it is a great slab of concrete or steel. In the Taipei 101 building in Taiwan, which was, for a time, the tallest building in the world, the weight is a golden sphere. It really is golden, and it weighs around 730 tons, which is roughly the weight of 150 adult elephants. It hangs on steel cables in the building's upper floors, and visitors can actually go and look at it. They stand on a gallery and peer at this enormous golden ball hanging in the middle of the building, and it is hard not to find it rather magnificent. And here is what this weight does. When the wind pushes the building one way, let us say it pushes the building to the left, the pendulum, because of the way it is tuned and the way physics works, swings slightly to the right at exactly the same time. And these two movements, the building going left, the weight going right, partly cancel each other out. The building still moves, but it moves much less than it would without the pendulum there. And the people inside, the ones at their desks on the 90th floor, perhaps, barely feel a thing. Isn't that a beautifully simple idea, hidden away at the top of one of the most complicated structures human beings have ever built? A pendulum. An enormous, expensive, very carefully designed pendulum. But a pendulum all the same. There are other ways that engineers help tall buildings resist the wind, and some of them are worth lingering on. One of the most important is something called cross-bracing. If you imagine a simple rectangle of steel, 4 beams making a square frame, you might notice that it is not as strong as it looks. You can push it sideways and it will change shape, leaning over into a parallelogram. The beams do not break, but the frame can be racked and bent out of shape. This is not ideal in a building. But if you take that same rectangle and add a diagonal beam across it, from one corner to the opposite corner, suddenly the frame becomes much stiffer. It cannot be racked sideways anymore because the diagonal beam holds it in shape. And if you add another diagonal beam from the other two corners, crossing in the middle to make an X, the frame is stiffer still. Try as you might, you cannot easily push it out of shape. This is cross-bracing, and you can sometimes see it on the outside of buildings. Some architects decide to put the bracing on the outside, where you can see it, rather than hiding it inside the walls. The Hancock Center in Chicago is one of the most famous examples. It has enormous X shapes running up its outside, great diagonal lines of steel crossing back and forth across the whole face of the building. It looks very particular, very deliberate, and once you understand what you are looking at, it seems quite beautiful. All that strength, all that logic, right there on the surface for anyone to see. There are also buildings where the diagonal bracing is woven into a kind of mesh or lattice, wrapping around the outside of the whole building in a diamond pattern. This is called a diagrid, which is a word that sounds quite strange, but simply means a diagonal grid. Some of the most elegant modern skyscrapers use this system. The Swiss Airy building in London, which people often call the Gherkin because of its curved shape, uses something very like it. The idea is that all those diagonals spread the load of the wind across the whole skin of the building rather than concentrating it in just a few places, and this is a very efficient way to do it. And then there is the wind itself, which deserves a moment of attention. Wind, when it hits a building, does not simply push in one direction and then stop. It swirls and curls. It goes around corners and creates eddies and spirals on the other side. It can, in certain conditions, create a rhythmic push and pull that makes the building sway back and forth in a regular pattern. And if this pattern happens to match the natural frequency of the building, which is the speed at which the building naturally wants to sway, then the swaying can get quite dramatic indeed. Engineers call this resonance, and it is something they take very seriously. They try hard to make sure that the wind patterns around a building do not match the building's natural frequency. And one way they do this is by making buildings slightly irregular in shape, tapering them as they go up. Giving them curved surfaces, or twisting them gently as they rise, or cutting notches and openings into them at key points so the wind has somewhere to flow through rather than piling up against a flat face. Before a very tall building is built, engineers often build a small model of it, sometimes only a foot or two tall, and put it in a wind tunnel, which is a machine that blows controlled air over it, and then measure exactly what the wind does around every surface. They watch the little model to see where the wind swirls, where it speeds up, where it creates pressure, and then they adjust the design accordingly. Sometimes the architects change the shape of the building based entirely on what the wind tunnel tells them. There is something quite charming about this. The final shape of a skyscraper, the thing you look at and think is just how it looks, is partly a conversation with the wind. The wind had a say in how the building turned out, even if no one who walks past it every day knows that. Now let us talk about the walls for a moment, because the walls of a skyscraper are also not quite what they seem. In a simple house, the walls hold the house up. If you took the walls away, the roof would fall. But in a skyscraper, the walls do not hold anything up at all. The frame does that. The steel columns and beams and the concrete core are holding everything up. The walls are just the walls. They keep the weather out. They let the light in. They give the building its look. But they are not load-bearing, as engineers say. They are not carrying any of the weight. This means the walls of a skyscraper can be made of almost anything. And for the last century or so, they have mostly been made of glass. Great sheets of glass, hung on slender frames of aluminium, covering the whole face of the building from top to bottom. Engineers call this a curtain wall, which is rather a nice image. The glass is like a curtain hung over the outside of the building's frame, covering it and enclosing it, but not holding it up. These glass curtain walls are made in factories, very carefully, in large panels. Each panel fits into the next, and they are designed to expand and contract very slightly as the temperature changes, because glass and metal do expand and contract with heat and cold, and if the panels were fixed too rigidly, they might crack. So there is a small amount of give built into every joint, a small amount of forgiveness. Again, a little flexibility, a little willingness to move makes the whole thing stronger. The glass itself is not ordinary glass. It is laminated and tempered, which means it is very strong, and if it does break, it breaks into small rounded pieces rather than sharp shards. Some of it has a tint, a slight blue or green or gray, that reduces the heat coming through from the sun. Some of it is coated with a very thin layer of metal, almost invisible, that reflects some of the sun's warmth back outward, while still letting light in. Modern skyscraper glass is quite remarkable stuff, doing several jobs at once very quietly. Let us go back to that idea of the building as a tree and think about it a little more, because it holds up rather well the more you look at it. A tree has roots that grip the earth and go down to where the ground is firm. A skyscraper has foundations and piles that do the same thing. A tree has a trunk that is wide at the bottom and slightly narrower at the top, tapered to be strongest, where it needs to be strongest. Many skyscrapers are also wider at the base and taper as they rise, not always, obviously, but often. The Burj Khalifa, for instance, gets narrower as it goes up, stepping back at various levels, and this helps it handle the wind. A tree's trunk is stiff and strong at its core, with the living, flexible sapwood just under the bark. A skyscraper has its stiff concrete core at the center and its slightly more flexible steel frame around the outside. A tree can sway in the wind without falling. A skyscraper can sway too. And a tree, once it is old and well established, just stands there, very quietly, not doing anything dramatic, not showing off, just being where it is, doing its job, which is simply to stay standing. And that is what a skyscraper does too, really. All that engineering, all those tons of steel and concrete and glass, all those pile-driving machines and wind tunnels and very careful calculations, all of it in service of the simplest possible outcome, which is just staying standing. Just being there, holding its shape against gravity and weather and time. There is something almost restful in that idea. The very first skyscraper, or at least the first building that engineers generally agree counts as a true skyscraper, was the Home Insurance Building in Chicago, built in 1884 and 1885. It was 10 stories tall and stood for about 50 years before it was demolished. By today's standards, 10 stories is not very tall at all. It is the sort of building you might not look up from quite so far. But at the time, it was extraordinary. It was the first building with a complete internal steel frame carrying all the loads, with the outer walls hanging from the frame rather than holding it up. It was the new idea, the thing that made everything else possible. And after that, buildings got taller quite quickly. By 1931, the Empire State Building in New York was finished. 102 floors, 443 meters to the roof, more if you count the antenna on top. It was built in 1 year and 45 days, which seems almost impossibly fast, even now. 3,400 workers were on the site every day. 7 million hours of work. And it was the tallest building in the world for 40 years. Think about that. 40 years. Not just in New York, in the world. And then, in 1972, the World Trade Center's Twin Towers were finished, and they were taller. And then the Sears Tower in Chicago was finished in 1973, and that was taller still. And then buildings in Asia began to compete. The Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur, the Jin Mao Tower, and the Shanghai World Financial Center in Shanghai, and then Taipei 101 with its golden pendulum. And then, in 2010, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai opened, and it stood 828 meters tall, which is not quite a kilometer, but feels very close to one. 163 floors. You could fit the Empire State Building inside it, tip to roof, and still have room to spare. Can you imagine standing at the very top of the Burj Khalifa on a clear day? The city below looking almost like a map. The desert stretching out in one direction and the sea in another. And the horizon so far away that you might almost see the curve of the earth. And beneath your feet, going all the way down through all those floors and all that steel and all that concrete, the foundations and the piles. Going down through the soft ground of the desert to the rock below, holding everything steady. And somewhere near the top, though not quite at the very tip, since it is inside the building, a great heavy pendulum, swinging very gently, very slowly, doing its quiet job of keeping things still. There are taller buildings being planned, and some being built. The Jeddah Tower in Saudi Arabia, when it is finished, will be over 1 kilometer tall, 1,000 meters, and it will need everything that every skyscraper before it has needed: deep foundations, a strong core, steel bones, flexible joints, wind bracing, and almost certainly some sort of damper system at the top to keep the swaying comfortable. And it will stand there the way all buildings stand, quite patiently, doing nothing in particular except staying up, resisting gravity, leaning very slightly into the wind, and then, when the wind passes, straightening again, rooted to the earth through the soles of its foundations. The people inside it will go about their days without thinking much about any of this. They will ride the lifts and sit at their desks and look out of the windows at the world far below, and never spare a thought for the concrete core at the center of the building, or the piles deep underground, or the damper up above them somewhere, swinging almost imperceptibly. And that is exactly right. That is exactly how it should be. Good engineering, like a lot of good things, is invisible when it is working well. It is a pleasant thing to know, when you are somewhere near a tall building, that all of this is quietly happening. That underneath the pavement there are long, quiet poles going down to the old rock. That inside the walls there is a skeleton of steel, patient and connected. That at the heart of everything there is a spine of concrete standing very still. That the building is designed to yield just a little, to sway just enough, to come back, always to upright. tall buildings are, when you think about them this way, rather reassuring things. They have been very carefully thought about. An enormous amount of human knowledge and care has gone into making them exactly as safe and steady as they need to be. Every beam, every bolt, every sheet of glass. All of it decided by people who spent a great deal of time thinking about what would happen in every possible weather, in every possible condition, over decades and decades of use. And then, when all the thinking was done, when all the calculations were checked and the wind tunnel tests were finished and the foundations were laid and the frame was built, the building just stood there. It just stood there, very tall and very quiet, holding its shape against the sky. The way a tree does. The way old things do. Things that have found their place and settled into it and intend to stay. Perhaps that is the most soothing thought of all, that there are things in the world that are very good at staying still. Things that have found a way to be rooted and flexible at the same time, to hold their ground without being rigid, to stand through all kinds of weather by being thoughtfully, carefully, wisely made. The great tall buildings of the world are doing this right now, in every city, on every continent. In the early hours of the morning, when the streets are almost empty and the lights inside have mostly gone dark, the skyscrapers are still there, still standing. The concrete core is in the middle, very solid, very patient. The foundations are deep in the earth, gripping the rock. The steel frame is holding its shape. And if the wind is blowing, the building is leaning into it, just a little, just enough, and then coming back again. And at the top, in some of those buildings, a great heavy weight is swinging, very slowly, very gently, back and forth in the dark, doing its quiet job, keeping things steady, hardly moving at all really, just enough. Just enough. And the building stands. And stands. And stands. And stands.